Oh, thank you, Albert Charpentier. Thank you for joining us. And also, I want to give a big shout out and thanks to Bill Hurd for connecting me with Albert, because this has been a number of times where Bill said the person you need to speak to is Albert. And then that was at during another TPUG meeting. And then when I saw Bill in Chicago for VCF this year, once again, Bill said, he whispered in my ear to talk to Albert. So thank you, Bill.
Well, yeah, Bill twists my arm, and here I am. No, it's actually looking forward to it. I don't really have a lot of background on your organization, but I figured, well, an hour's worth of time is always useful to
Wonderful.
put it.
Well, thank you. I want to make the most of our time. Just a brief biography.
Yeah.
Prior to founding Ensoniq, Mr. Charpentier was Vice President of Engineering at Commodore Computers, where he led the development team responsible for the Commodore 64 computer. I am really excited. I'm going to try to contain my nostalgia here, but I just found out that you are the founder for Ensoniq.
Yeah.
I should be ashamed to not have known this, but having been in electronic music, this is a real delight and a surprise. Thank you.
Yeah, that's impressive. A lot of obviously you have to be an audiophile sort of, or to be able to know about Ensoniq. We certainly had a nice run there. It was great. I really enjoyed doing it, and it was a fun project to be working on after a Commodore.
I want to get to that question and that time period in your life, but before we get to 1983, can we please go back in time? Where are you from, and what got you interested in science and computers?
Okay, so I joined Commodore after I got out of college at Penn at 1974. Okay, it was actually MOS Technology at the time. It wasn't Commodore, and MOS Technology was a chip company, and I had taken semiconductor physics as well as circuit design for my engineering, and then got a job out at MOS Technology. And their main product back then, they had two products. They had memory products, RAMs and ROMs, and they had calculator chips. They were all a chip company. And so when I joined there, learned about, worked in the fab, learned about how that operated, and then moved into product engineering. Spent about a year doing that, and then by 75-ish, I was really moved into the design team, which is where I wanted to be, and worked on memory products. So back then, I designed a 32K bit ROM and a 1K static RAM, and eventually, so that grew, and eventually I did a 64K RAM, which, if you remember the Atari 64K ROM, remember the Atari 2600? So they wanted to do a asteroids game, but the memory space that allowed in the cartridge was only 32K bits of ROM, but they couldn't fit the game into that. So somehow they found us, or we found them, and I designed a 64K bit ROM with a bank switching structure in it that allowed them to switch what bank they were using to manage the game during the blanking time. So it allowed them to fit the asteroids game into that. So that was sort of, I actually loved games. I mean, I was a real gamer back then in the early days. And interestingly enough, even from the time I was 8 years old, I always wanted to know how a TV set worked. And I really wanted to try to, when I took my engineering degree, I wanted to learn how to control a TV set. So after I did the memory products, Commodore came out with, MOS Technology was acquired by Commodore. And Commodore was the big calculator company that actually our biggest customer. So they acquired MOS Technology. And at the same time, but between that, also the 6502 group was into MOS Technology, and they were from Motorola, Chuck Peddle and Will Mathis and Bill Mensch. There was about 5 guys that came from Motorola, and they actually developed 502 microprocessor NMOS. So I was doing memories, they were doing microprocessors, and then when Commodore took over, there was a lot of upheaval and a lot of people left and a lot of changeover. And I made a proposal to Jack Tramiel, who was the head of Commodore, that I'd like to do a video chip. And they said, well, can you do one? And so I made this enormous PC board. It was literally like 15 inches on the side with all the circuitry inside to control a TV set so that I could prove to them that I could do something. And that was actually the precursor of the video chip that eventually became the VIC-20. Okay. That was my first video chip design, was the VIC-20 video controller. Okay. And so that's how I got into video. And that was my first foray. And then after the VIC-20, I mean, there's a whole other backstory for how the VIC-20, how the chip I did, the VIC-1 chip, turned into the VIC-20. But as that progressed, I then wanted to do the VIC-II because I knew the VIC-1 chip wasn't good enough to do really quality video games. And that's how I came into wanting to do the VIC-II chip, which eventually became the Commodore 64. So all that architectural stuff that I did in the VIC-20, I then moved over to into the Commodore 64 with even more capability, and became the product that we sold bazillions of. Yeah.
The VIC-20 was my first computer, so thank you.
You're welcome.
I received it on my birthday that year, / Christmas, because my birthday is near Christmas, so you only get one gift, you know? And my parents gave me a data set with it.
Oh.
I know you've heard this before. The computer changed my life.
Well,
thank you.
You're welcome. You know who else the VIC-20's first computer was? Elon Musk.
Yes.
Yeah.
Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to get him as a guest.
Oh, did you want Elon? I can like look into it for you.
Yes, Bill. Yes, thank you, Bill.
Let's have him at World of Commodore.
There you go.
There you go.
Just ask him on Twitter.
So the checks that he writes to you personally, how big are they, Albert?
Yeah, I've always
No kidding.
To say hello, but I'm not looking for much publicity.
So, Albert,
I did meet him about
what
20
was your first interaction with Jack Tramiel? First memory.
First
memory.
Well, my first memory is the fact that he addressed the engineering team in the conference room, okay, for the acquisition, and he really only knew about calculators, and we wanted to really bring him up to speed on the whole computer stuff that we had. All this, the Kim 1 was out, and that whole 502 was there. So we really wanted to let him know that was going on. So I know that Chuck made a push. I certainly made a push for the fact that, hey, computers were the next thing. And I recognized that he was very open to ideas. Okay, and that was what. And I wanted to do a video product. So after that meeting, I made a presentation to the general manager of the building of MOS Technology, that Commodore at the time, and then he then talked to Jack, and then this whole thing turned into, okay, prove it. So that was my first memory of the fact that it was he was willing to give you some free rein to go out there and try some new things. Okay, so that was my first opportunity there, and it was fun. I mean, it really a challenge, but yet something I was really looking forward to doing.
You're muted.
Who?
Nico.
Thank you, Bill.
Oh,
Awesome. Thanks. Before getting some other questions, I'm curious, what were you doing at the Consumer Electronics Festival that year when the 64 was released. Do you recall that day?
Oh, big time. Yeah, I mean, we had gotten the first pass of the video chip. We had done the microprocessor and added the bank switch, an I/O port for the bank switching. So that was a relatively easy design to change to add that to the processor. The sound chip was operational, and the video chip came out sometime in early November, late October, I guess. Early November, yeah. And it had a bug in it. So we quickly figured out what was wrong, and then we shipped that back into the fab. The fab got it running, and they ran the thing through, and it worked well enough that we sort of get things running, but had some bugs in it in the sprite area. And we literally got it shipped out of the fab the week between Christmas and New Year's. And it worked. And we were ready to go to the show. And I think we made 5 or 6 prototypes that we took to the show with us. And everything was operational at the show. And it was like a wow. It was a huge hit. I mean, we were just inundated at the show with people and everything that you could hope would happen at the show. And it was clear that this was going to be something that would sell well. So it was fun. I mean, we had done things with the video chip one that we tried to actually sell it to game companies. And that's how I got to meet Steve Jobs, and I did get to meet Bill Gates at these shows. And but it was something where I really felt like, okay, I've done something here which is going to be exciting. So that was a fun time.
And what was Steve Jobs like at the show, and Bill Gates? What was their demeanor?
Well, they were there, obviously as Microsoft and Apple, and they came by to see what we had. And even in the earlier CESs that we went to with the VIC-20, and even before the VIC-20, I was trying to peddle the video and chip to game companies, and that's what we were doing at the CESs or the shows at the time. And I got to meet Wozniak there, and they were wondering, because the Apple at the time didn't have color, so they had it. I do color, and so that was how that happened. And we met a few times, and then Bill actually had licensed the Apple, the basic operating system back in the old the PET computer. Bill had licensed that. And that same operating system was the one that was used in the VIC-20 as well as in the Commodore 64. So, it was just back then, it was the Wild West. And everybody was starting up and trying to do their thing, And so you'd wander around the show and meet the folks.
What challenges or obstacles did you face with the 64?
Well, it was a lot of work, I have to tell you, because this was before the era of all the computerized checking. Like, all the logic was done by hand. We had no logic simulators. The only simulators you had was SPICE. So you would be able to splice some of the circuitry to make sure it was fast enough to go. We had to run the thing at 4 megahertz, which at the time was really fast. Okay. And to get the circuitry to work well enough was difficult at that speed, and the chip got hot, and we ended up having to put a heat sink on the chip that was actually part of the FCC can that was over top of it, and it was a struggle to get things to run that fast and all the other circuitry that was involved. So, and I had this literally a 12-foot long logic timing diagram that showed one frame of everything that would happen within the chip, so that I could make sure that all the timing was right and the logic was right, because you had to do it by hand. And then when the chip was done, you had to actually check that the interconnect was right. So I had this literally 12-foot by 12-foot plot that we laid out on the floor, and you would check by hand certain pieces. Now you had step and repeat, so like on a memory or a counter, you don't have to check one cell and make sure that that they were right, but you still had to go through all that in the individualized circuitry to make sure it was right. So that's why the chips were only, maybe 10,000 transistors, if that. That's probably about the size of what it was. And there was also a chip limitation. We could only do a chip that was 200 mils on the side because we couldn't. I mean, the yields back then, whereas today you get 90% yield, 95% yields on wafers. Back then, it was 35%. On a good day, you get 40. So if the chip was too big, you just didn't get enough of them to make them economical. So there's a lot of constraints that you had to go through to get the chip to work. So it took about a full, thinking about 14 months of work to get it done and running. So, it was a lot of work and long days, but I enjoyed it. I mean, it was a challenge. There's no question about it. There was all these I have a funny story then. After we introduced it, I always wanted to have 40 characters on the screen. The VIC-20 had 20 characters. I wanted the Commodore 64 to have 40 characters. Bill knows the story. When the original VIC-II came out in the Commodore 64 that we presented at the CES in 1982, it only had 36 characters on the screen. And I really wanted more characters. I wanted that 40. So I wanted to speed up, and also too, I was running it at 3.5 megahertz, which was the color dot frequency, which is what a lot of people did. That's what Atari did and so forth. But that meant that if you made a 1 and 0 pattern on the screen, it would actually make a color, which I didn't like because it allowed you to not have the defining control over the system. So I changed the chip after the CES show to make it go faster so that it would actually produce 40 characters. So I had the dot clock, which was the 4 megahertz, and then we had the color clock, which was 3.5. Well, the chip came out and it worked, except for one problem. I had forgotten to synchronize the clocks, so there was a shimmering on the screen, and it was really bad. So, so anyway, one of the guys in the team knew about phase lock loops, which I didn't know at the time, and said, "Oh, we can take it and we can create a phase lock loop that will create the 4 megahertz and lock it to the 3.5 megahertz so that they're in sync." We added that piece of circuitry at the last minute, and it solved the problem. And you had a very nice control over the dot size as well as the color. The final piece of that is that Jack Tramiel got wind of what I had done. Okay, and he was not happy. And what happened was he called me into his office and he just stared at me and goes, "What were you thinking? You could have ruined this whole company and you bet everything on it. And what was your backup plan?" I said, "I didn't have one. I knew I could get it to work." He didn't know what to say to that one because it did work. Okay. But it was a little bit of an moment when we saw that shimmering. It took us a few days to figure out how to redo the PC board of the board and add that piece of circuitry, because we had to get it in production in May, I believe it was around May, and so we only had a few months from the 6th. So it was like run, and I made this change, and that was it was kind of the Wild West, if you will. That
run and gun, yeah,
I was running it, so I made a decision, and we went ahead and did it. But that was a bit of a panic time, but it worked. And I got 40 characters.
Yes,
that's great.
And no shimmer.
And no shimmering. That's right.
What were you expecting to accomplish with the megahertz clock speed on the 6510? And what were your fears, your greatest fears?
Okay. Since we had the VIC-20, all of that architecture, I thoroughly understood. The main thing that both in the VIC-20 and the Commodore 64 was a concept of direct memory access and shared access to a shared RAM area, so that the graphics processor, the video chip, and the CPU could both have access to that memory in a high-speed fashion. And actually, we're one of the first people that did that. Okay, now it's passé, and you have graphic processors that have high-speed memory and you DMA to the processor all the time. But what I did was there was really no, quote, DMA process in the 6502. So, but it only actually captured data
Here's two
on the
booths.
half phase.
One outside and one in here.
Right. So anyway, I set it up and said, okay, phase one of this 1 megahertz clock is going to be for the video, and phase two is for the microprocessor. So that forced the memory to run at 2 megahertz, but the memory access for the graphics chip as well as the processor was running at 1 megahertz. So they were both hammering it at 1 megahertz, and the memory was running at 2. So that was how we created that opportunity to have a very good graphics system with DMA.
And most of the other processors would not have worked that way at the time.
That's correct. So the 6502 had that nice little quirk that it would only I could manage the speed of, I could essentially create that back and forth communication to the memory, and they wouldn't step on each other.
Right.
Yeah. So they were but again, that whole concept had been fleshed out when we did the VIC-20, and so we just moved that over into the Commodore 64. So it was a pretty basic thing on architecture. We didn't have to manage too much architectural variation there.
Right. Hey, Albert, I wanted to introduce you to a young man, Ben Mon, who's like 2 things below me on my screen. He's currently doing the teenage develop on a 64, make a video out of it, get controversial. It's fun to watch it happening all over again. So I just wanted to introduce you to this generation's thing. So you're still doing it 4 generations later.
Who was it again? I'm sorry. I don't.
It's this young man. Say hi, Ben.
Hi.
Hello. Yeah.
So yeah, here, that's for you, Ben.
Yes, I was wondering about that.
So, all right. Sorry, Nico. I just did it
No
again.
problem. No problem. Albert, so, you come back from Vegas, and the 64 is released. What are your job duties at this point? Because I see that you're moving on to a new phase.
Yeah, and that was an interesting period. So we worked real hard to get it into production in the Palo Alto facility that was manufacturing the PC boards and the whole product. Okay, and eventually it ended up moving to Japan, but I wasn't there for that. Bill would know about that. So it was sort of the end of that design process, moving it into manufacturing, and we shepherded into there. And what I wanted to do then was what I referred to as the Commodore 80. Okay. And by that time, Commodore had grown quite a bit, and it wasn't the Wild West that originally was existing. There was a lot of other folks that had a lot of opinions. And so back, I started making proposals about doing the Commodore 80, okay, which was basically going to be an 80-column color system. 40, and so similar, 80 columns, 40, like an IBM type of PC. The IBM had not come out yet. I think it was just about to come out, but basically that kind of character set, the capability with the Commodore 64-like graphics capability. And but you had to have a built-in screen because screens wouldn't handle that kind of thing. And I wanted to have a disk drive in it. Gee, it starts to sound like a Mac, unfortunately. But this was before Mac came out. So this was back in June of 82, July of 82. So I pushed and pushed for it, but that there were other folks in the other parts of the company that really wanted to do a different, I'll call it a follow-on to the Commodore 64, which was called the +4. He's going to laugh. He knows what I'm talking about. And that
are those other people in this room?
No, there's nobody here who was there. At any rate, what happened was we were at a show. It was the June CES, okay, and I was with Jack. And he basically, I went over and over, and I said, you really need to do this. This is the next step where computers have got to go. We build in disk drive, higher speed disk drive, and so on and so on. And I outlined the product that I wanted to do. And after 3 days of haggling, he basically, I can still remember, we were getting off the plane and we're getting into the car. And and he was sitting in front, and I was sitting in the back, and he turned around and he said, "No, a computer's just a big calculator. It needs a spreadsheet, a word processor, and a couple other things." And he said, "What more do you need? We're going to do the +4." And in the back of my head, I said, "I'm out of here." And so, at any rate, that's where I made a decision that said I'm not going to be able to do the next generation that I wanted to do, and I made plans to decide what else to do afterwards.
So, how far had you gone designing the Commodore 80 at this point?
Well, at that point, it was just a twinkle in my eye. Okay. And when I left Commodore, I actually started to design it. Okay. Bob Yanes, who did the sound chip, the SID chip, he left with me. And Charlie Winterbull and a couple other guys, one other guy, Bruce Crockett. So the four of us left. And I started to work on the video design and the audio design. And we were looking for funding. We did get some commitments from the folks and some venture capital people in Palo Alto. And right about the time they were supposed to deliver the money, they called up and said, "Well, we're going to pull the offer. We're not going to fund you guys." And the answer was, "Well, see, Commodore has the low end, IBM has the high end, and Compaq has the middle, and there really isn't any room for anybody else." I was like, "What?" And so here we are. We're slowly dying from lack of money, and we got a chip the audio chip was almost done. The video chip still had a ways to go, and I was basically also basing it off of an 80 to 8086 at the time. It might have been 8088 because I don't think 8086 was available yet. But at any rate, I was going to move over into a full MS-DOS kind of a system away from the 6502 because I felt there was a better marketing opportunity for software there. So that was what the design was based around. But basically, we get, okay, it's pivot time. We've got an audio chip that's just about done, and we know how to make that work. Gee, let's do an audio company. We're going to call it Ensoniq. So that's how Ensoniq was born out of.
Wow. I mean, is it too dramatic to say out of the ashes?
Well, it never got ash phase.
No.
Fortunately, we never got that bad. It's just that it was kind of disappointing not to be able to do the next generation computer that I wanted to do. But you know what? We built a beautiful company in Ensoniq. I mean, no regrets there whatsoever. So I wouldn't say it's ashes. I enjoyed it. It was a great run for almost 18 years. It was really fun.
Are any of the details of the Commodore 80 available?
No, I wish I would have kept those presentations, but I didn't because when I left, I was so worried about being sued and so forth, because that was pretty common back then. It still is today, I guess, that I didn't take anything. And so I don't have any information about it. I would have loved to save the presentations that I made just as a memento, but I didn't keep anything, though.
Did you have a mock-up and what it looked like?
Oh, yeah, I had drawings. We never got to a 3D mock-up, but we had drawings of what it might look like, and it was basically sort of a smaller version of a pet computer, okay, but with an attached keyboard. So more like that kind of a look, all right. With a
5.25 floppy?
Yeah, 5.25 floppy. Yep. Yeah.
Okay. That's all we had.
Yeah, the 3.5s didn't exist yet until the that was about 84 when they came out, and that's what we actually used in the Commodore keyboard. I mean, in the Ensoniq first keyboard, we used the 3.5-inch floppy because they had finally become readily available. But back in 82, they were not. So it was a 5-inch floppy. Yeah.
Alpha K asks, did your desire to do an 80 columns have any relation to the C128's 80 column mode?
Well, I'm going to move that over to Bill because I left in September of 82. And so I kind of abandoned everything. And I know that had life after me in Bill and his group there. And I think you tried to pick that up, right, Bill?
The 80 column?
Yeah, an 80 column display. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, we definitely did. I was going to put a 6845 on it, And Bob Ola caught me in the hall and with another young engineer, and he's like, "Hey, can you use his chip? They've canceled the Z8000 machine, and it was built for that." So I said, "Sure, it's a 6845 superset," and he said, "Yep." Years later, I figured out he didn't know what a 6845 superset meant.
Oh,
That was on me. So
yes.
yeah, but we did it next to the 64. You know, there was no easy bridge to 80 column. I know it's in Albert's head here, I think, and there was no easy bridge.
No, that was I guess part of the other problem is that marketing really didn't like the fact it was just another new thing and there was no way to bridge. You just couldn't do it. It was just to be too hard.
Yeah.
So a lot of it was really marketing. You know, again, it's when you're deep at that era in the world, it was very difficult for people to know where things were going. Okay, and there was a lot of people trying to figure it out. So you had a lot of competing interests going on, marketing and engineering and so forth. So it became difficult sometimes to move the needle, and that's why startups generally were able to move a little bit. Once you got big enough, it slowed things down.
Didn't you have a high-speed interface on a C64?
Oh yeah.
What happened to that?
I knew that the VIC-20 suffered from the slow disk interface, and that bothered me because of the fact you couldn't download game stuff fast enough and change, get a new level in there. Okay, you got to remember, I love games, and so I basically added a high-speed serial interface to the system so that we could put in a higher speed disk drive. That got shot down in the process because they had all this inventory of VIC-20 disk drives that we had to continue to sell, and so it got kind of saddled with that slower disk interface, unfortunately.
Right. I heard marketing had some input also on your high-speed drive.
Yeah, that was a problem because, again, it was one of those ones that it was like, well, they have all this inventory and VIC-20, and I don't think they recognized how fast the VIC-20 would die once the 64 was out. So it's like they didn't realize that things change so rapidly and you have to really keep up.
Right.
And it was rather than the transition of things that people were used to in technology. So yeah, it's just again, it's what happens in technology is moving rapidly. It's hard to keep everybody on the same page and wanting to take the risk. And the Commodore was very risk oriented earlier on, and as it moved forward, I could see it when the decision not to do an 80,
right?
And Bill saw it in his after me that the risk tolerance was a little bit. They weren't willing to tolerate as much risk as Jack was. Jack left in 84, right? I think it was. Yeah.
Wasn't it 80? It was what you and I would have called the 84 CS, which would have been 84, right? It would have been the 83 CES, in other words, 1984. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, Jack was more of a risk taker, but but at the same time, he didn't have I think back in 82, he didn't have the knowledge of what's happening in the computer industry. What might happen, but again, when he left, the risk tolerance at Commodore was not high anymore, so it really slowed down their development effort, and that's what happens.
Albert, you said you founded Ensoniq right after that VC fell through.
Yes.
What is your musical background, and what made you go into this business?
Okay. I don't have a musical background, but I understand physics and I understand FFTs and I understand memory and basically the architecture that is used in Ensoniq is basically the exact same video architecture we used in the Commodore 64, but instead of having to pull the data out to make video.
You're blowing my mind here, Albert. I mean,
I'll attest to that. It was even drawn by the same girl, Sue, who had worked at Commodore. So even the schematics look like Commodore 64 schematics.
Yeah.
Guess who's going to be doing some YouTube, eBay searches tonight?
You're right. Yeah. So
Looking for some
basically,
Ensoniq instruments.
it was an audio chip that did direct memory access, and that allowed us to do multiple voices
Wow.
that other synthesizers at the time couldn't do because it was expensive to do them in analog, and we just had direct memory access, so I could get as many voices going as we could go through, and as big as the chip could be. So the original chip, I think, was an 8-voice, base 8-voice was a synthesizer, but it really was essentially a memory playback system, so that we could do a real piano, and that's what drove all that. Because gee, what do you want a keyboard to do? Piano. So how do you make a good piano? You record one and play it back, and then our chip essentially did the phase shifting from note to note. So you would record a note, and then about 3 or 4 notes up, you record another one, because once you phase shifted it or frequency shifted it by about 3 or 4 notes, it would start to get a little wobbly and crazy. So about every 4 notes, we had to record another piano note and have that in memory. So you'd play through, and then as you played up the keyboard, it was just doing frequency, and then it would go to the next block of memory to play the next 3 or 4 keys on the keyboard. So that way we'd actually be able to have a recording of a piano in a reasonable amount of memory, so that you could sound like a real piano playing a keyboard, electronic keyboard.
Did that set EEPROM, that sample of the piano?
No, it was in DRAM, because that we wanted to be able to. That's what the floppy disk was for, so that we have a piano. If you wanted an organ, you could download the organ into the RAM. You wanted a guitar, so it was actually all on RAM. We did, I think, in some of the later synthesizer versions we did put it in ROM, but the very first one was all RAM. That was called the Mirage. Was the first? Yeah. And for obvious reasons, you would hear a piano, but it was a Mirage.
That's cool. So, and it had a blue LED.
And built blue LEDs, right? Blue LEDs. We put a blue LED in there to be special. At any rate, but that's the transition. It was sort of like, wow, I can't let this company go, and how do we transition? And Bob Yanes and he knew about the audio too. He was an audiophile, Bob, and so we just collaborated, and we said, okay, we got to move this audio chip to keep alive, and we did.
What contact did you have with Jack afterwards? Did he give you his blessing, or how was your relationship?
Well, he sued me after I left.
Ouch.
He was not happy with me because of the fact that clearly I had done some good product design for him. And he was actually afraid that one of his board members had funded me. And he was dying. He was really paranoid about it, and that somehow they were going to build something and compete with him. So he had sued me in order to be able to find out who was funding us. At the time, it was one of his vendors, and he then cut that vendor off when he found out that vendor was funding us. But I had also done a project for Atari when I left. That was another thing that pissed him off, is that in end of '82. I did a project for Atari that would have allowed the 2600 to look like a VIC-20, and it was a big cartridge that you plug into a 2600, and it had a DMA structure so that you could upload it and change the things so you could do characters. So I treated the 2600 as a video display system, and then the processor and everything were in the cartridge. So we actually sold that design to Atari, which gave us funding to go ahead and start Ensoniq. So I didn't, but he thought we were being funded dramatically, but it was really the Atari deal, which also pissed him off. So it was another customer. So that was the basis for the suit. He didn't win the suit, but he found out who was funding us and things, and that's how it ended up. But
he gave you the money back, didn't he?
Oh yeah, it's Bill. I told Bill all these stories before. This is when Apple did a product called the Apple II GS, graphic and sound. Okay, this was about an 85 or 6. And they needed an audio chip. Well, guess who had an audio chip? So anyway, I go out to Apple and trundle down there and meet with Jobs and his team and so forth. And and we licensed them our audio chip. And they paid us. But it was funny because they said, well, we're going to build 1 million of these. And I wanted so many cents. And they said, well, how about if I write a check for the full royalty now? And I went, I need the money. I'll take it. So it was a one-time big check so I could keep the company running. And then Jack Tramiel was in at Atari. And
Right.
Atari needed an audio chip. So I go out to Atari's headquarters and sit down with Jack, and we start to talk. And I said, well, Jack, I'd be happy to do business with you, but we have a little problem. I spent an awful lot of money on lawyers when you sued me. and that's going to have to be part of the deal before we can do anything. And he grumbled and he went, all right, we'll do it. So it was nice. I mean, it was, we had both chuckle over it because, you know, we were both in different worlds at the time, and it was funny, but it was an interesting meeting up again a few years later and having a whole another opportunity to interact.
So it sounded like it was cordial at best.
It was cordial. He knew. I mean, it was Jack had a saying, business is war.
Right.
Okay. And to him, if it were business, you were just doing what you had to do to compete. And that was okay. I mean, and I understood that. And you know, it was one of those things where, yeah, I was annoyed. But you know what? You don't, if being annoyed doesn't help anybody, you go on and do what you have to do, and then you figure it out. And it just so happened it came around, and I got a chance to recoup.
DJ asks, the VIC-II color palette is iconic and forever etched in my 8-bit memory. But was there ever a consideration for having a higher color palette like the Atari 8-bit family?
No, and not at the time, because I couldn't fit it. And the way that the color was done, I had a sign. I had a 14 megahertz clock that came into the video chip. And then you bring it down to 3.5 megahertz. And then I essentially phase shifted the square waves by 90 degrees. So you had sine and cosine. And then I had to put analog filters on them to create good sines and cosines. And if you remember your trigonometry, if you take a sine and a cosine of various amounts of amplitude, you get a phase shift. And color back in 1982 on TV sets was defined by the phase shift of the signal. So I could only fit enough resistors to make 8 colors. And the ones that I had to fit them in. So like cyan and things were like, okay, what can I squeeze in here? And that's what I could do. But I had to have red and blue and yellow, okay? And the other ones are just happened to what was left over. But it was just basic, trigonometry and sums of cosines and sines in order to get the phase shifts that I need. And that was all handled, I just had a big multiplexer to select what resistor was you're going to use, and that would determine the amplitude of the sine and cosine.
Don't you have a patent with that?
Yeah, we did. We patented that. Yeah. And it was also the sprite collision logic was also patented.
Jeff Brace asks, looking back, what are some of the most valuable lessons you've taken from your experience in creating that 64? Are there any aspects of the 64's development that you would approach differently in hindsight?
I'll answer the second question first. No, I mean, it really was what I could accomplish in the time, and it really was pushing the envelope of technology for what you could do with chips back then. So I really, it would have been nice to do more, but the chip would have gotten too big. I mean, so I couldn't do any more in the confines of what we had to work with at the time. So, but I learned a lot about art. Obviously, in having to architect this whole thing, that same architectural structure was what was used in the audio system. And if you even look at graphic systems today, I mean, they're basically just DMA systems in the very high-speed memories with a graphics processor that's banging the heck out of stuff in order to put stuff on the screen. So architecturally, what was in the Commodore 64 is still what propelled the industry going forward. So architecture, I wouldn't, I mean, we were moving so fast. I really wouldn't change much. The constraints we had and what we were able to accomplish, it was, I don't think I could do much better.
Alpha K asks, why doesn't Bob Yanis ever show his face? Is he real? The SID chip gave birth to multiple genres of music, really important culturally.
Yeah.
Is he real?
Bob is very real, yes.
Okay. He's not a phantom in the chip?
No, he's not a phantom. Bob was a partner of mine for 20 years. I actually hired Bob out of Villanova University when he graduated. And there's an interesting background story to that. When Bob was coming in for his interview from Villanova, I had the prototype of a processing system for a video game using the VIC-20 system in the lab. And I showed it to him and he goes, wow, this is really cool. Can I take that and take one of these and do my senior project at Villanova on it my last semester? I said, sure, I have no problem with that. So he does his project, and what he built was a little computer out of it with a little operating system, keys and so forth, and able to type some stuff on it. And so when he finally graduates and he starts working at Commodore, he brings this along, and him and myself and Charlie Winterble, we all look at it and go, wow, that's pretty neat, So we ended up showing that prototype to Jack Tramiel the next visit he came into, and Jack loved it. And he wanted to, and so he said, I want this to be a computer. Okay, I want to do this. So he calls Chuck Peddle, Chuck was really into business computing and the pet computer. And so Jack said, you should have seen what I just saw. I want you and your team to take what this guy did and turn it into a computer. And that became the VIC-20. Okay. And Chuck didn't like me from that moment on. Because he knew it was a consumer computer, and he was not about consumer computing. He really wanted to do business computing. But Bob is very real. And then we left Commodore together and founded Ensoniq and all the way through. And then he decided that he just wanted to go and enjoy life after that.
So I've heard that Bob doesn't really exist. He's just a bunch of phase accumulated sine waves.
No, he's real and a nice guy. He just decided that, okay, just wants to enjoy life and be in the background. Yeah.
That is hilarious. Thank you, Bill. Dan asks, the C128 C64 mode suggests that Commodore understood the importance of maintaining a healthy, safe software ecosystem around a hardware platform. How early did Commodore realize the value of supporting 64 software in future computers? How did the company think about the difficult problems evolving the platform and the ecosystem, considering the relative newness of the idea in personal computing?
Well, I mean, I left before that happened. And while it's certainly a valuable thing to have that software platform, at some point you have to say you've run a string and that you've got to move to the next level. And I think that having compatibility for one transition is a good idea, like with the 128. But I think that it definitely it costs you in the long run. I mean, you think about the Apple II and the Mac; they were completely different, and I think there was a clear win there. So it's a mixed bag. I think it's important, but again, you got to look at where you're going and can you get there on the old platform. Bill, you had much more input, much more knowledge about that process than I.
Right. And I can say that, I inherited the TED and went through the full TED cycle and met the people on the end of the cycle going, but that's not compatible with all this time and effort I spent supporting Commodore. So I got a guilty complex, and Fred Bowen did too. And so the idea of C64ness came from the engineering department, not marketing. Then they invented it later. They're like, oh, excellent. By the way, it's 100% compatible. By the way, it does 512K.
Oh yes, that's right. Yeah.
Steven asks, do you have any guidance on building FPGA implementation on the chip or developing a better software implementation for better accurate 2GS emulation?
Wow. I mean, I've used FPGAs a lot on other chip designs that I've done as simulation, but I've never thought about doing an FPGA structure for simulating the 64. Bill, you actually, again, you might be more knowledgeable than me than that, because yeah, I've never thought about what it would take to do that. I really have not. I could be a really good solid answer there. I always tend to move on.
There's an amazing package called the Mr. FPGA, Albert. I'll have to show it to you because you can turn it into anything, Amiga, Ataris, anything.
I've seen them. Yes, I have. I just have never implemented or worked on something like that where I feel comfortable saying, okay,
right.
Here's how
right.
I would.
Okay. So, Mr. FPGA, yeah, I've heard about that. Great minds think alike. Barry wants to know, Albert, does it surprise you that people are still making games for 64 and even selling them? Did you ever think for a second when you built this machine that new software would be written 40 plus years later?
Well, I certainly didn't believe 40 plus years later, but it really is nice that the fact that I built this architecture as certainly it could do if a product can do a game, it can do a computer. Okay, there's enough processing power to pull that off. So I knew that could happen. But just because something's a computer doesn't mean you can do a game, because the graphics processing is significant, and that's what the chip was supposed to do. And I love the fact that people are still finding ways to make an interesting game out of the thing at 40 years later. It is surprising. I certainly would not have expected it, but it's very heartening in the fact that it was something that I originally wanted to design myself, and I loved all the games that people did for the 64. That was fun.
Did you envision Commodore 80 as being backwards compatible? Speaking of ecosystem?
No, I did not. And that was probably one of the reasons why the marketing people didn't like the idea. I really felt that, just like the VIC-20, and you couldn't really make the Commodore 64 compatible with that. You were going to essentially leap to the next level. I really felt that you had to go, okay, this has got a run of a few years in the 64, and then you bring out the next generation of computer. Okay, and so my vision was not to be compatible at the time. So again, that may be why people didn't like it.
Were you going to call it the C80?
That was my name for it. Yep.
So are you open to licensing the C80 if one of us want to build it?
Surely. I mean, if I could find my specs for it, unfortunately they got lost in my I left.
We'll have to continue this conversation. Yeah, this would be great. Maybe a mini C80.
Yeah, right. And that's what it was.
Kevin wants to know, do you have any stories of working with Shiraz Shivji? Sorry if my pronunciation is incorrect.
Shiraz Shivji, yeah. Yeah, he came in about the last 6 months or so as the Commodore 64 was coming up, because he was going to be responsible for product engineering in that. So he had to learn about the whole system, and he helped with getting the product through FCC. A couple other things, the casework, because he was involved with what was happening in Japan for the case. So that was that was his thing. And so to take the design that we did and help move it into manufacturing, and he did a good job. I mean, he was a good man. But again, I had to interact with him for about 8 months, maybe. Bill, did you interact with him more than that?
He hired me.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah. I almost blew my job interview by jumping in his chair, not realizing it. And the next sound I hear is Shiraz going, "Excuse me, you are sitting in my chair." I was like, ah. So we had a saying, Shiraz went to the desert, and that was from his FCC stuff that, He went to the desert and came back with approvals, basically.
Yeah, and he was very helpful in getting the 64 through the FCC approval to sell it. Yeah, that was one of his strengths.
Albert, you mentioned about 15 minutes or so ago about people having different ideas at Commodore at this point. We're talking about after Vegas. And you kind of glossed over that, but I can put the pieces together, but could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, okay, I mean, clearly after January of '82, it was pretty euphoric. You had the VIC-20 was a good product, but the enthusiasm over the 64 was incredible. So it was like, how do we get into production as fast as possible? We're running like crazy, and what kind of software support? How do we get people to start to use it? How do we get prototypes out there to software developers? So it's just a tremendous amount of activity going on. And I guess a lot of folks were focused just on that. And there was a few, I mean, I was one of the few people that go, okay, what's next? And there was some folks in marketing who were also looking at that and proposing as what Bill called the TED, which was originally +4 in the vernacular that I was involved with. But I was the one who was pushing that what's next, and people were in jack's ear about the +4, and that's what happened. I mean, it was really the fact that there weren't that many people. There was some folks who said, okay, the +4 is where it's at because it needed these 4 or 5 things. And again, it's like Jack said, it's a big calculator, right? What more do you need? And again, it's not understanding what a computer's about. But a lot of people didn't back then. So you can't take them and you can't go, well, they were wrong. No, it's just that a lot of people didn't know. So it's just that they made a decision that I didn't want to, and I didn't agree with. And ultimately, I think history proved them wrong, unfortunately.
Alpha K is asking about the SX64. What was your role in that? The SX60, the executive?
Yeah, I wasn't involved in that one. I literally, when C64 came, I was going in August September 1st of '82 was my last day. So I really, the SX, were you involved with the SX, Bill? I don't know.
I believe it was purely the Commodore Japan Tokyo office OEMing it to JBC or somebody.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So it was good OEM. They got the best DRAM, the best VIC chips.
Oh, yeah, I didn't.
We just figured something out. Albert, I was talking with June, who we talked about before. She changed the Rev VIC chip in the 64SX, and it looked like crap. And what it sounded like was they had tweaked the dot mask, the delay of the dots to hit the dot mask just right on this little small display. And when it wasn't synced, just as you were talking about clock syncing, it's like it has to sync to the shadow mask.
Right.
Yeah. And she said it looked like crap.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The color and the sync clock, the dot clock have to be dead on. And when, again, that.
It's such a tiny dot mask on the SX.
Absolutely. Yeah. 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 I remember. Yeah. I know what the SX is, but I wasn't involved in that at all.
Right.
No.
Alpha K asks, I remember a story of a jar of bad 6502s in the Moss days. Would love to hear your take on that.
Oh, that was when they were in. That wasn't what I remember about that was a CES show that we went to where we were going to build. We were introducing the 6502. And back then it was in 76, 77. 6502 was out, and we were going to charge $20 for a microprocessor. And that was an unheard of price. Processors were going for $100 back then. Okay. And the 6502, from a little company in Pennsylvania, is going to be producing a microprocessor for $20. So as part of the marketing ploy at the show we were going to introduce this at, they filled up a big jar of chips, which were 6502s, which were the bad ones, of course, and they filled the jar up with them and had it on display to sort of show we can make tons of these things. we got them all over. We can throw them in jars. We got so many of them. We're throwing them in jars. But it's fascinating because that worked. Because guess who picked up the 6502? Wozniak, and that became the Apple. Right, that was in the Apple. So that ploy worked to get people to take serious note. Wow, a $20 microprocessor. No, that was the background I remember for that.
Chuck tells the story. His wife took the money.
But it was good. I mean, that's I mean, Nintendo used it. I mean, there was just so many people using the 6502 for a variety of things. I mean, obviously the Atari used it. I mean, it's, you know, so it was really a pretty big deal that it changed a lot of, it really brought microprocessors in the consumer world.
I sent you a link to the, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Bill. No, go ahead, Bill. Sorry.
I sent you a link to the 6502 song, didn't I, Albert?
No.
Oh, I'm going to do that now in the background. It's a wonderful song by some talented people that love the O2.
Well, it was a nice processor. I mean, it had a lot of nice features in it, and the team there did a great job. You know, I wasn't involved in that design other than doing some spice simulations for people. That was my only involvement in it. And then I put in the I/O line for the 6510 that we use, you know, in order to be able to do the bank switching effectively.
Right.
What did you learn at Commodore that shaped you as a CEO at Ensoniq? What were some of the qualities in envisioning yourself as a CEO who would then be surrounded by engineers and you would be the recipient of ideas?
Well, one thing was how to get a product from concept to finished. How to, and that's a big deal. I mean, a lot of folks can have ideas, but how do you take that idea and make it happen, and then take it from the lab and get it into production? And it's not a trivial process. You really have to have discipline to make that happen. And I learned how to do that at Commodore. Okay. And I mean, I will say that I always wanted to have my own company. And I told myself that by the time I was 30, I was going to do that. And I did leave Commodore 2 weeks before my 30th birthday. So that had nothing to do with it. But, and maybe if Jack had agreed to do the A-Day, that may not have happened. But, so, you know, I did understand that learning how to build a business. And Commodore, when Commodore took over MOS Technology, acquired it, Commodore was only about a $24 million company. So it's a small company because selling calculators. And then it grew to literally by the time I left, I think it was pushing $1 billion. Okay.
Yeah.
So
we hit $1 billion. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So I learned how to grow and do that and to build a staff. And I had, you know, I had the engineer, you know, a small group of engineers working for me, but I learned how to think about that. And that was the key there. But had to keep your eyes open and make sure you're learning all the time what's going on, not just, you know, blinders. So that's what I was doing.
So I'll add to what Albert was saying. These guys, and one thing Albert's good at is that conception to real life production. And that's kind of then the culture that was still there when I got there, and we learned how to play with live ammunition. Yeah.
Right. It is scary when you go, okay, we're going to turn, we used to refer to as turn the big crank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you hear a whole run go on the floor. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because you had to commit a lot of money. I mean, even if at Ensoniq, I mean, you build a design and then you got to commit to a run where you're going to put enough product out there to stock the store shelves and so forth. So you're going to commit to, 3,000 pieces, and the bill of material runs, $800-900. All of a sudden you're talking a $3 million commitment for that first run. Boy, you better have it right.
Dan asks, how did so many companies manage to get production licenses for the 6502 or the 65XX? Nintendo used the chip, Hitachi, but not other MOS chips.
Because of the fact that the MOS did not patent anything on the 6502. There was no patent protection for it. And so Bill Mensch left Commodore, and he was the guy who architected it along with Bill Mathis. But essentially, it was a free. I mean, once you knew what the construction set was, you could copy it. I mean, it was that way that it got spit out. Now, when Apple and another company was going to use the 6502, they wouldn't use it because Commodore was so small that they needed a second source. And Commodore licensed it to Rockwell, who had a chip facility at the time. And Rockwell was a second source. So that was another way that it got out there. Okay. So it was because back then, people would go, well, what if you guys can't produce these? Where do I go next? So second sourcing was a key thing back then. It doesn't exist. It's not necessary today, but back then it was very important.
Right. Synertech picked them up also as a
right,
license.
Exactly. Yes, Synertech was also a licensee. So, there were just a lot of folks out there. Now, Commodore was getting a license fee for them. Okay. Yeah. But then eventually Bill Mensch, I think, did one in CMOS and his Western Digital's design center. And then he did that, and he did 6502 in CMOS, which was then used in the Nintendo game.
Cool.
Alpha K wants to know, how related were the Ensoniq ASR internals to the SID chip legacy?
Not much, no. I mean, because the SID chip was essentially, I'll call it an analog synthesizer. It had 3 voices. It didn't have memory access. So it was essentially, you had essentially a frequency generator and some filters and some amplitude control. But they were not, you weren't able to access memory. So it was a classic version of the original synthesizers that were done by, I forget, but anyway, they were what do you call it, sequential circuits, and I think not sure
Moog, ARP,
Moog. That's where, yes, Moog.
Yeah.
Moog synthesizer. It was actually based off of Moog and Sequential Circuits, which is another synthesizer company. It was based off of what they did, so it was very different. The audio chip, we called it the DOC1, digital oscillator chip, was the chip in Ensoniq, and that was essentially a video architecture with some filters and things like was borrowed from the SID, okay? But it allowed you to essentially recreate a real instrument, which is what the original idea was.
Do you recall how many patents you had to file for the first Ensoniq model?
Wow, I don't remember. I mean, I have over 20 of them, so I don't remember what company they are with. I know we had 3 or 4, I think. Okay, and also we people threatened to sue us because there were things that did playback of memory to make sound. Okay, and so we tried. So people tried to say that you were doing the same thing, but they never really went anywhere. We never really got sued. They threatened to, but nobody ever did. But we had a few patents in there that I don't remember the number at this point. But it was a few.
Who was one of your big musical artists that you signed on as a?
It was a lot. Well, we had let's see. Oh, Bill, who? It's the. Oh goodness, my brain's going blank here. Well, we had. Let's see. I know Steppenwolf used it in their keyboard area. We had Chicago used it. We had Janet Jackson use it. We had. Who was the one they did? Bill, did I tell you about the one with the gold platinum record? Who did that? Love Shack, the band that did Love Shack, they used it a lot.
B-52.
Right, B-52. So they actually had sent us a copy of their platinum album because it went platinum that album. And they one of the key things they used was Ensoniq keyboards on that. Let's see who other. I mean, just we had so many. I just can't even recall them all. I mean, the guys.
One of the stories I love, Albert, was Russ Gray was a big who did I'm Your Captain. Oh shoot, I just forgot the name of the.
Yeah, funny how.
Yeah, it's because we're old, Albert.
Yeah, right.
But anyways, so here's the guy that he's listening to in his headphones, and the guy comes up and taps on the thing, going, "That's a good record." It's, so well, yeah, you didn't know who you ran into there.
Yeah, I remember I was at a music store in L.A. and the guy with the deep voice, Barry White. Okay,
right.
Yeah, and we recorded him. And it was so funny because I played it up the keyboard and his deep voice became a falsetto. And he laughed about it because, like, you know, you just play up the keyboard and it would just it shift his
Very White.
That's a great story. This DJ has a question for Bill and Albert. One of Commodore's strengths was designing and fabbing their own chips. Knowing Commodore's fate, was owning a fab a hindrance in some way?
No.
Yeah, I mean, if you weren't going to spend money to do that, yeah. I mean, if you look at anything going forward in history, the fab houses did fab and then design houses did design. So the answer is yes to that question. I don't think Commodore 64 could have existed without that capability because it allowed us to really push the limit of what the fab could do and how what we could stretch out of it. But yeah, in the long run, it was definitely a liability because because they had it, they used it longer than they should have. I believe, then rather than saying, you know what, let's go for better technology that other fabs have because ours is behind the times.
Right. And what I'm told, they did outstrip in Jeff Porter's time. They did outstrip what MOS or CSG, whatever they were called by then, could do. And one of the problems they had was paying their bills for their ASIC productions and prototyping and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, at Ensoniq, I mean, we basically had Samsung. We had quite a few of the fab capabilities. That's what we used for our fab, and it was great because it really gave you freedom to look at new technology and new speed stuff. So
that's the metal gate CMOS you're talking about, right?
Yeah, all CMOS. Once we got out of I think once I left Commodore, I think everything was CMOS at that point. I'm thinking maybe the Dock 1 wasn't. That may have been the only one that wasn't, but after that was all CMOS. Yeah.
Did you find yourself making trips to Japan and Asia once you settled in your new role? And how was that strategy?
I was all over the world. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can't build a company and be global and without doing a lot of traveling. Yeah. So Europe and Asia were. I somehow wonder how I lived through it. It's a lot of work. It was intense.
Anyone talking about the ASR 10 today focuses on the color of the sample quality. It felt different than other samplers. Was that an accident feature?
Well, I mean, no, I wouldn't say it was an accident. I mean, we did spend a lot of time in studios to get the sound, the quality of the samples that we used. Okay, I can remember being in a again, I didn't do that. We had audio guys that were really good at that, and we'd go into a studio, we'd bring in a Steinway and record it very carefully to get the nuance that we were interested in getting for that. Okay, so a lot of our quality was a function of the skill of our studio guys who would record it, and then we digitized it and used it. But I think that was the key there. It was that really gave us our, I'll call it a signature sound, if you will.
You talked about some of the early models with the floppy drive integrated. Any move towards cassettes or magnetic tape or other storage
No, not an Ensoniq. No, we stayed with that 3.5 for a long time. I mean, it was we never went any. It was just too convenient. Okay, and if you wanted more, just throw some more DRAM in it that we could load into. And it was nice because it didn't limit us then, and we could putting out other floppy disks that would have a whole new set of sounds, and you wouldn't have to commit to building a ROM or building a cartridge. You just record something, put it on, and ship it out there. So it was just so convenient.
Anybody else have any other questions they could ask? I think it's good that the mics are muted, but Alpha K, true story, people do RAM upgrades to Ensoniq since these days, but still use floppies.
Really? I didn't know that. I mean, I guess it's possible. I guess, yeah. I mean, yeah, I don't know how you would do that off the top of my head, but I'm sure that people can figure out how to do that. It's not that difficult. Yeah.
Oh, Matt is re-asking. Apologies. Speaking of FPGAs, are you aware of the recent Kawari project that replicates functions of VIC-II and coincidentally adds a true 80-column mode?
Bill, I don't know. Do you
Haven't heard of? Yeah.
No, don't know.
There are so many things out there, though. It's just it's amazing. There's 3 times as much as there was 5 years ago.
Yeah. One of the things I went to that show you took me to, Bill, the computer history museum. That what was it? The vintage computer thing.
Right.
And I was fascinated when Bill drug me along. He convinced me to go and
like I'm doing this year. You're coming this year on Friday, but go ahead.
And anyway, I was amazed at how many young people were there. Yeah. And I asked some questions of some of them, and it was interesting in the fact that again, the professors and so forth, the teachers were teaching them, and they said the Commodore 64 is a computer system that has all the same features or functionality of computers today, but it's small enough that I can understand it. Yeah. I can get my arms around it, and it teaches me about what a computer system is because I understand it has all the same pieces. That was a fascinating answer. I thought it was very, very interesting about that it's you can understand it and get around it and know all the pieces, whereas today's computer systems are formidable, and it takes a lot to understand them.
They love the DIP technology too, because it's exactly that. It's repairable. You can get in there, look at signals, replace a chip.
Right. So anyway, I've had some fun, guys.
We've really enjoyed your time. Thank you so much, Albert.
Okay, fine. All right. Well, Bill, I will be talking to you tomorrow. Okay.
Okay. Uh-oh.
Good enough, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Albert.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.